Chapter 15, Part 3, Radical Reconstruction in the South, and Part 4, The Overthrow of Reconstruction. Part 3. The Reconstruction Act sparked great political activity amongst former slaves in the South, who held mass meetings, went on strike, and tried to desegregate public transportation. Thousands of Southern blacks joined the Union League, an organization tied to the Republican Party, and the vast majority of eligible black voters registered to vote. In the words of one former slave turned political leader, blacks had heard the tocsin of freedom. By 1870, all former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union, and most were under Republican control. Their new state constitutions, drafted in 1868 and 1869 in conventions with substantial black representation, were an improvement over the old state constitutions. They created state-funded systems of free public education, penitentiaries, and orphan and insane asylums where none existed before. They guaranteed equality of civil and political rights and abolished antebellum practices such as whipping as a criminal punishment, property qualifications for office holding, and imprisonment for debt. Though blacks were the majority of Republican voters, white Republicans controlled the state Republican parties and held most political offices. Only South Carolina, with a high percentage of blacks in the population, had a majority of black legislature. But the 2,000 African Americans who held public office in Reconstruction represented a radical shift of power in the South. 2 blacks were elected to the U.S. Senate, 14 were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and 1 served as the first black governor in Louisiana. Many blacks served in state legislatures, and more blacks than ever before held lower offices such as sheriff, tax assessor, and policeman. Most were former slaves. The South's new state governments also empowered new groups of whites. Some were Northerners who migrated to the South after the war. Opponents called them carpetbaggers, implying that they packed their possessions in a suitcase too quickly to move to the South and gain the spoils of office. While a few were corrupt, most carpetbaggers were Union Army veterans who decided to stay in the South after the war. Others were investors in land and railroads seeking economic opportunity. Yet others were teachers, Freedmen's Bureau officers, and others who traveled to the South to help former slaves. Most white Republicans, however, were from the South and were despised by former Confederates, who saw them as treasonous scalawags. While the few were wealthy whites, most were non-slaveholding small white farmers from the southern upcountry. Many had been Unionists during the war or hoped Reconstruction governments would pass laws favoring indebted farmers. The Reconstruction government's greatest accomplishment was establishing state-supported public schools that served both black and white children, although usually in segregated schools. They also passed civil rights laws that made it illegal for railroads, hotels, and other institutions to discriminate by race. Some states also strengthened the economic power of rural blacks by passing laws favoring agricultural workers and sharecroppers. But Reconstruction governments did not try to promote economic prosperity through land distribution, as many blacks had once hoped, but rather tried by developing railroads, which they hoped would spur industrialization, urbanization, and diversified agriculture. Every southern state tried to finance railroad construction and attract industry through tax and subsidy policies, but a revitalized southern economy failed to take shape. Nevertheless, Radical Reconstruction transformed the South by empowering poor whites, northern migrants, and former slaves. Part 4. The Overthrow of Reconstruction. The South's traditional leadership, planters, merchants, and Democratic politicians, condemned the new governments as corrupt and inefficient examples of black supremacy. But corruption, which existed in Reconstruction governments, was confined to no single race, region, or party. The rapid growth of state budgets allowed many to enrich themselves at public expense, but corruption was greatest elsewhere, in the whiskey ring, involving Grant administration officials and New York's infamous Tweed ring, controlled by Democrats. Rising taxes needed for schools and railroad development also sparked opposition to Reconstruction, including among poor whites who had initially supported the Republicans, but bolted to the Democrats when their economic situation did not improve. Southern whites opposed to Reconstruction primarily because they could not accept that blacks should vote, hold political office, or enjoy legal equality. They thought Reconstruction should be overthrown in order for white supremacy to return and planters to have a disciplined and dependable workforce. Violence was endemic in the Reconstruction-era South. At first it was local and unorganized, with blacks being assaulted and murdered for refusing to make way for whites on sidewalks or trying to purchase land. But the establishment of Republican state governments after 1867 ignited organized campaigns of violence against supporters of radical Reconstruction. Secret societies, most notably the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK, tried to prevent blacks from voting and tried to destroy the Republican Party by assassinating local leaders and public officials. The KKK, a terrorist organization started in 1866 in Tennessee that soon spread throughout the South, functioned as the military arm of the Democratic Party in that region. In many counties, it started a reign of terror against black and white Republican leaders. But blacks were especially targeted, particularly blacks who held office or exercised political rights. The new Southern governments could not suppress the KKK, and in 1870 and 1871, Congress adopted enforcement acts that outlawed terrorist groups, allowed the president to use the army against them, and defined acts that deprived citizens of civil and political rights as federal crimes. President Grant dispatched federal marshals and troops to suppress the KKK, and by 1872, most areas of the South were peaceful. Northern commitment to Reconstruction declined in the 1870s. Radicals, such as Thaddeus Stevens, passed away or otherwise left politics, and they were replaced by figures less dedicated to equal rights for blacks. Northerners more and more felt that the South should solve its own problems without continuous federal involvement. Many in the North believed that now that the national government had freed the slaves, made them citizens, and given them the vote, blacks had to depend on themselves. In 1872, an influential group of Republicans, angered by corruption in the Grant administration, and believing that federal power needed to be reduced, formed their own party, calling themselves the Liberal Republicans. They nominated Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, for president. They repeated Democratic criticisms of Radical Reconstruction as encouraging corruption and preventing the rule of the best men in the South, that region's natural leaders. Democratic leaders embraced the Republican split and endorsed Greeley, but many rank-and-file Democrats could not stomach Greeley, a former Whig and Republican, and Grant won his second term to the presidency by a great margin. Nonetheless, liberal Republicans and Democrats in the North could now agree on rolling back Reconstruction. Northern critics stepped up their often openly racist attacks on Southern governments as dens of corruption and misgovernment ruined by black rule. A severe depression beginning in 1873 also distracted Northern Republicans from Southern issues. Democrats were widely successful in the 1874 elections and took control of the House of Representatives, but before this new Congress met, legislators passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which barred racial discrimination in public accommodations such as hotels and theaters. The Supreme Court also signaled a retreat from Reconstruction in the slaughterhouse cases of 1873, in which it held that the federal government could not effectively protect the legal and civil rights of individuals in the states, effectively mitigating the 14th Amendment. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction was under serious assault. Democrats regained control of states with large white voting majorities such as Tennessee, North Carolina, and Texas, and called themselves Redeemers for having redeemed the white South from corruption, misgovernment, and Northern and black control. Violence flared in states where Reconstruction governments persisted, and the Grant administration now refrained from protecting besieged governments and Republicans. In 1875 and 76, armed Democrats on Election Day simply destroyed ballots and drove blacks away from the polls, capturing states such as Mississippi and South Carolina. Events in South Carolina directly shaped the outcome of the 1876 presidential elections. Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who ran against the Democrats' Samuel J. Tilden, New York's governor. By 1876, only South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana were still controlled by Republicans, and the election was so close that whoever carried these states, which both parties claimed to have won, would become president. Congress tried to resolve this impasse by appointing an electoral commission, which with a Republican majority decided that Hayes had carried the critical southern states and been elected. But to secure this result, behind the scenes, Republicans negotiated with Democrats, agreeing to recognize Democratic control of the South and refrain from future federal interference in Southern affairs. Democrats promised to respect black rights and not dispute Hayes' right to office. This became known as the Bargain of 1877. Hayes quickly ordered federal troops to stand down, which allowed Democrats in Louisiana and South Carolina to occupy the state governments there. Reconstruction, defined as America's adjustment to the end of slavery, continued long after 1877. Blacks still voted, and in some states held office well into the 1890s. But a distinct period in which Republicans controlled much of the South, blacks held some political power, and the federal government protected the basic rights of all American citizens came to an end in 1877. Only a century later, in the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s, would the federal government finally act to secure the rights of all, regardless of race.